Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Coming up today on The Story.
The people at the local Presbyterian church were very friendly immediately and welcomed us, but they said openly, look, we really frown upon parents who just leave their children and go off and do their own thing. We really would like one of you to stay. And I said, all right, I will. And from the very start, Eric, I just got interested.
The Story.
G'day, I'm Jimmy Colefax. Welcome to The Story. Well, Roy Williams was topping his class in law school and was hired by one of Australia's oldest and most prestigious law firms. All was going well in his law career when he decided to send his 4-year-old daughter to Sunday school. And then something surprising happened when he stayed to hear the sermon. Roy Williams is the author of several Christian books, including Mr. Eternity, the story of Arthur Stace. Roy joins us today from his home in Sydney to share his story. He's chatting with Eric Scatterbo.
Roy Williams, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Glad to have you with us, and I'm looking forward to hearing Arthur Stace's story, that book, Mr. Eternity. That's very interesting. Everybody knows about Mr. Eternity and how the word eternity was on the Sydney Harbour Bridge on New Year's Eve, 1999 or 2000, however you want to look at that. So that's a fascinating story, and you had the opportunity to share that. Is that right?
Yes, indeed, Eric. I had the very great honour and responsibility of telling Arthur's story properly for the first time at the invitation of Bible Society Australia back in 2017.
And your co-author for that book, somebody who actually knew Arthur Stace?
Yes, Elizabeth Myers. Her father was a Baptist pastor who knew Arthur very well, and it was actually the man who unmasked him to the public in 1956 as Mr. Eternity, as the man who was writing the word in chalk on Sydney pavements. So Elizabeth was a mine of information about Arthur and very passionate to get the book written. She'd been trying for years to do so, and finally it all came together. I was the scribe, the hired gun.
Well, it's a wonderful story of how somebody who was down on his luck, a drunkard, I guess they used that term back in the 1930s, and he went from that to writing the word eternity all over Sydney, and then to have it be put on the Sydney Harbour Bridge at such a pivotal moment in the history of Sydney on that New Year's Eve at the turn of the millennium. Wow, what an incredible story. I'm looking forward to hearing that. But first, today, we're going to focus on your story, how you became the author of that book and several other Christian books. But first, it all started off, you had a law background. Let's go back even further. Where did it all begin?
Well, I probably should just say a little bit about my upbringing to put my story in context. So I grew up on the North Shore of Sydney. I was born in 1963, and I lived in a very happy, comfortable home with my parents and my younger brother. My parents were extremely intelligent, cultured and ethical people, but they weren't Christians in any meaningful sense of the word. They've both died recently, but and I don't quite know how they stood with God in the end, despite my best efforts. But the key point about me is that I was brought up in a thoroughly secular home. I did go to Sunday school in the late 1960s, early 70s.
Yeah, apparently that was common at that time, even though your parents weren't churchgoers and didn't have any time for religion. But it was important to them to send you to Sunday school.
It was conventional. And my grandmother was a Christian. She was actually the daughter of a Presbyterian minister. But your mum and dad were not. But yes, that was just the done thing in those days. It's hard to imagine now, but I was at the tail end of that phenomenon.
So you did have some spiritual input in your life at that point.
Look, the very basics, but I mean, I was probably only about 7 years old when I ceased going to Sunday school. I did have one or two Christian friends in primary school. But look, to be honest, Eric, it made no lasting impression on me. And I'm quite ashamed in retrospect of how ignorant I was of all things Christian, despite being what I thought was a highly educated person, and I suppose I was in secular ways. but I had this huge gap in my knowledge, which I didn't discover until my mid-30s.
And your parents were involved in progressive politics at that time?
Yes, so that was our religion. That was our family religion. My father was very heavily involved with the ALP, the Australian Labor Party. He worked for prime ministers and premiers. So that's what we imbibed in our home. The virtues of, certainly hard work on an individual level, but also giving back to the community through the Labor Party.
And turning to your education, you did well in school?
Yes, I did well in school. I did extremely well at university. I just had a knack for passing law exams with high marks. So I topped my year, as you were kind enough to say, at Sydney University, and then moved straight into the law, straight into a job in my early 20s.
And that was going well? You were in a prestigious law firm and you were made a partner at age 32?
Look, in the eyes of the world, it was all going extremely well. And look, I was able to do the job very competently. To be perfectly truthful, I never much enjoyed it.
Is that right?
Yeah, I realise now that it was extremely valuable experience for me.
How so?
If you're a practising litigator, which I was, you're dealing daily with other people's problems, and you see the best and worst, with a focus on the worst of human behaviour.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
Yeah, you begin to understand how the world really works.
Yeah.
And it's in general not a pleasant picture, especially when huge money's involved and high stakes. I was a litigator, commercial and media law, so I had a lot of high-profile clients. It was at the cutting edge. As I say, I learned a lot. A lot of the skills I now have, I wouldn't have but for that experience.
Yeah. So it sounds like you knew firsthand about man's sinful nature.
As someone once said, the doctrine of original sin is the only one that is proved every minute of every day.
Yeah. So that part of Christianity, it didn't take a lot of convincing for you.
No.
You're like, yeah, I know that one. Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, I understand that one.
Yeah. Okay, so here your life is going on, successful, but as you mentioned, ironically, not really enjoying it. And then all of a sudden, you decided out of the blue to take your daughter to Sunday school class. How did that come about?
Well, again, to tell the honest truth, I think I had in mind a couple of things. One was, look, I went to Sunday school when I was her age. She was 4.
Yeah. So following the tradition?
Following the tradition, which by then had more or less died out. But
But you're going to keep it alive.
I thought she should go, but I expected just to be able to drop her at the door, as my parents had always done with me.
Yeah. But you're in for a little surprise, huh?
Yeah. So the people at the local Presbyterian church in Sydney, the Sydney suburb where I lived, Roseville, were very friendly immediately and welcomed us, but they said openly, look, we really frown upon parents who just leave their children and go off and do their own thing. We really would like one of you to stay. And I said, all right, I will. And from the very start, Eric, I just got interested. Sat in the back of the church. I was probably only half listening to what was going on for the first few visits, but I dipped into the Bible in the pew. I distinctly remember that. I distinctly remember reading passages from a couple of Paul's letters, and it was an annotated Bible, and I remember just very early on realising how little I knew about Christianity, this big gap in my knowledge, and I became fascinated. Just being the sort of person I am, I read voraciously. I read my way into it. I thought my way into it.
Intellectually?
Intellectually at first, but the Spirit was clearly moving in me. I remember reading the Gospels on the train going to and from the city and reading the Sermon on the Mount and having one of my first light bulb moments, wow, this is essentially where all of those ethical rules that my father drummed into me came from. This is it. This is the source of Western morality.
Yeah.
In the most beautiful language, spoken by this extraordinarily charismatic figure. That's how it appeared to me in the first few weeks and months.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how did it go from the head to the heart? How did God capture your heart?
Yes, I've often tried to put myself back in those days. I think I first became convinced because I read widely apologetics, the likes of Lewis and Schaeffer and many of the classics. I also read a lot about science. I was fascinated early with trying to reconcile modern science with Christianity. That I realised had been a subconscious deal breaker for me. I'd assumed for a long time that the two were irreconcilable. And so I actually read a lot of science, including not necessarily science books written by Christians, probably came later to those. But the more I read about science, the more I came to believe in a creator. That this universe, this world just could not be an accident. I suppose I became a deist before I became a Christian.
And basically, what is that?
A deist is someone who believes in a creator God, but not necessarily in Christ. I mean, so people of many religions would be called deists. They believe in God. And I guess for a month or so, that's what I was. But then I started reading and listening to the words of the gospel and reading into the case for Christ and the early Christian church, how it got started. And I remember an Easter sermon where a visiting minister just spoke about the basic evidence for the resurrection. And that made a big impact on me. See, the other thing you've got to understand, Eric, is I was coming at this as a lawyer.
Yeah.
So I was searching
You're
for
looking
evidence.
for a case.
I'm looking for a case. There's a really neat little book called The Case for Christ by
Lee Strobel.
American journalist.
Yeah.
I found that useful in the early stages. I mean, it's not a terribly sophisticated book, but for someone like me who was coming at it with almost no background knowledge, it was something of a revelation. And then you read more and more widely, of course.
And then also, going on in your heart, you realized later that you had been yearning for something.
Yeah, I had. I mean, the other part of my story is, well, I've alluded to the fact I was unhappy in my job, but I although I was very fortunate, earning a lot of money, doing interesting things, there was this yearning. And the other aspect of my conversion was the sheer experience of Christian fellowship.
Yeah, why was that important to you?
Because for the first time in my life, I was mingling with people with whom, most of whom I had very little in common with, and who didn't expect anything of me. There was no...
And you hadn't experienced that before?
Not really. Life had always been a contest, striving to succeed, striving to please people, starting with my parents and then at work and so on. So the first time you sort of had people just welcoming you on a quite unconditional basis, people of all ages, both sexes, mixed backgrounds, and that was, I found it touching. I was genuinely touched by it. I also loved the singing of hymns. I found that very emotional.
So that's how it moved from the intellect and the head down to the heart and the emotions and feelings.
At some stage later that year, probably within 6 months, I realised I'm a believer. I mean, of course, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And it's a constant journey. But that's how it began for me.
You're listening to The Story. Today, Eric Scatterbo is chatting with Roy Williams, who's sharing his life journey and how he went from being a lawyer to being an author of several Christian books. We'll hear more of Roy's story when we return.
The Story. If this program has highlighted something you'd like prayer for, we'd love to pray for you. Call 1-800-PRAY-FOR-ME. That's 1-800-772-936. It's a free call. Or text 0401 132 888.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Colefax, and this is The Story. Our guest today is Roy Williams, who's the author of several Christian books, including Mr. Eternity, the story of Arthur Stace, which we'll focus on next time. But today, Roy is sharing his story and how he became an author. Before the break, we heard how he became a Christian. Now, we'll hear what happened next in his life as he continues his chat with Eric Scatterbo.
Okay, your background at that point, you're a lawyer, hanging out with, intellectual lawyer type friends and all that. What did they think of your conversion?
Well, many people were surprised and puzzled, both family and friends and colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
I think my father found it hard to understand. I think I'll never forget a couple of comments from friends. Oh, Roy, you're the last person in the world I would have expected to fall for this sort of rubbish. What's the story? But other people were interested, and a few people were positively moved. People I then learnt were Christians themselves. So that was a fascinating experience.
Mm-hmm.
And for some years, I tried to explain to people why I'd become a Christian. And after a while, I realised I wasn't doing a very good job of it. That injunction in Peter's first letter that we should all be ready with an answer
mm-hmm.
to anyone who asks the reasons for the hope that you have. And
mm-hmm.
around about the time I was about to turn 40, I made a determined effort to sit down and actually write out my reasons. Again, it's just the sort of person I am.
Mm-hmm. Everybody's wired differently, and it's great to hear how God uniquely called you, unique to the way you're wired.
Indeed. So I was a highly literate, rational, evidence-based lawyer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was like writing submissions. Right, the next time someone asks me, these are my 5 top reasons. And so it started as a little sort of précis for myself, then an essay to myself. Eventually, I became obsessed with it, and it was a book-length manuscript, which I was sitting on and started giving to a few people. And a few came back and said, gee, Roy, this is not half bad. I mean, I don't believe it, but it's not. You should try and get it published. Some Christian publisher will publish it.
Oh, really? So non-Christians were reading it?
Yeah, well, that's why I wrote it, Eric.
Yeah.
I wrote it for non-Christians. I wrote it for people like I had been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People who were immersed in the secular world, who were very well educated in many things, but accept the most important things. My aim throughout my career, such as it's been as a public evangelist, has just been to get people to take Christianity seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think by and large I've been a failure in the sense that most people who've read my books are Christians already. Some of them don't agree with me on quite a few things, but to actually try to convert secular Australians in the 21st century is extremely difficult.
Mm.
The country we now live in is increasingly not merely indifferent to Christianity, but positively hostile to it. And although conversions happen every day, it's not an easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
As any of your listeners out there will know if they've tried it.
Mm. Yeah, especially just reading a manuscript. But at least seeds are planted, and you're sending the message that our Christian faith is intellectually credible.
Correct. That's essentially what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
Just at the very least understand. I haven't suddenly gone insane. I've reasoned my way to this.
Yeah.
And the Christian story has held up for 2,000 years against all of the greatest minds throughout the world.
Yeah.
At least until very recent times. And look, a few people have genuinely taken it on. My brother, I'm still working on. I think he's about 2/3 of the way there. I don't think I ever succeeded with my father. I suspect he died a deist and not a Christian. he wrote this long letter to me after I gave him the manuscript, and more or less said that he'd just never been able to believe in the divinity of Christ. But he wasn't prepared to accept the universe was simply an accident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
An uncaused accident. Yeah.
And this essentially became your first book.
Yes. So this, another little bit of my personal story is probably required here. So in my early 40s, I had what in old-fashioned language would be called a physical and mental breakdown. Mm-hmm. And I had to take a long time off from legal practice. And it was in that period of
burnout. What caused the breakdown?
Look, it was diagnosed as a severe depression, and also I had a couple of quite serious physical ailments as well. Mm-hmm. But the depression was the long-term problem, and I had to decide, taking into account medical advice and lots of advice from family and friends, often conflicting, what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, after a lot of prayer and soul-searching, I actually decided to leave the law. Mm-hmm. Wasn't an easy decision for many reasons. Many people were angry about it, but I decided to leave the law. And I then had to decide, once I'd recovered somewhat, well, what am I going to do with myself? The only skill I have is writing. And I actually come from a family of writers. Both my father and brother were journalists. My brother still is. I was the odd man out being a lawyer. And I had this manuscript, and I hawked it to publishers all around Australia. And initially I was knocked back by everybody. Mm-hmm. I had a perfect set of rejection letters, including from the publishers who ultimately published it. And including from Christian publishers who I now know really well. Huh. But it was actually God's grace, because the manuscript wasn't good enough the first time. And by his providence, I was led to the one literary agent in Australia, and there aren't that many of them, who agreed to look at my manuscript and work on it with me. This lady was a Christian in Brisbane. And with her assistance, we got God actually into publishable form, and it was snapped up. I was astonished. It was snapped up, published by ABC Books. And
now, the secular ABC Books?
Yes, indeed. It was part of the ABC in those days.
Yeah.
I think they were attracted. It was at the time, you may remember, Eric, when Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and the so-called New Atheists were bestsellers. And I think they saw me, well, this guy doesn't seem to have two heads, and he's trying to take those people on. You know, this could be quite interesting.
Oh, so it could be part of the debate.
Part of the debate. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was really hoping for.
Yeah.
I challenged Dawkins to a public debate when he was in Australia. But
is that right?
Never heard back from him. But anyway, to cut a long story short, that book became something of a bestseller in Australian terms, and it got picked up in Britain and North America. And it introduced me critically to the Australian Christian scene. Mm-hmm. So this is where I made a lot of friends, people who are now friends, close friends, through that book, you know, being invited to speak all around the country, and also at secular writers' festivals, which was another experience. But that got me started in my second career as an author.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but you went on to write several Christian books on various topics, and also including the one we talked about at the beginning, the biography of Arthur Stace, Mystery Eternity.
Yeah, it's just a wonderful story. Really, the job of any writer was just to do justice to it. Mm-hmm. And there's an argument that Arthur Stace is Australia's greatest ever evangelist. And I don't say that lightly, but in terms of the number of people he reached, ultimately with his message, he probably influenced more people than anyone, even the most learned theologians and of all Christian denominations.
I was
Remarkable
already
man.
interested to hear his story, but now you're making me even more interested to hear Arthur Stace's story. Will you come back next time to share his story?
I'd love to tell Arthur's story.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story with us today. Roy Williams, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Eric.
Well, that was Eric Scatterbo chatting with Roy Williams. Roy's the author of several Christian books, including the one we'll focus on next time, Mr. Eternity, the story of Arthur Stace. To find out more information about that book, you can go to the website mreternity.com. Once again, that's mreternity.com. Also, the first book that Roy wrote that we heard about today is called God Actually and is available online and at Christian bookstores. That's the book where Roy decided to put down all of his reasons for becoming a Christian. As the Bible says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And so that's exactly what Roy did in his first book called God Actually. Well, thanks so much for joining us today for Roy Williams' life journey, and we invite you to join us again next time for the story of Mr. Eternity, Arthur Stace. Until then, I'm Jimmy Colefax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.
Next time on The Story.
From 14 November 1932, we know the exact day, until shortly before he died in 1967, he wrote this single word, eternity, in chalk on the streets of Sydney and beyond. He did it every day for 35 years, virtually without fail. And he became, in later life, a celebrity.
Author Roy Williams joins us to share the story of one of the most influential Christians in Australian history, Arthur Stace, who came to be known as Mr. Eternity. It's a remarkable story because at one point in Arthur's life, it looked like he had no future as he sank deeper and deeper into alcoholism. We'll hear Arthur Stace's incredible story next time.
The Story. Just another way Vision is helping you look to God daily.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.